Georgia.
No, not that Georgia, the other one. This time we're bringing you the story of an innovative new training programme that's happening in Georgia and what the war in Ukraine has to do with making it possible. Welcome to The Learning Hack, a podcast about the people and technologies that are creating the future of learning. I'm John Helmer.
Now guess what?
Learning is cool. Learning is cool. Learning is cool. I'm learning.
Learning is fun.
Knowledge is power. Knowledge. Education.
Recently I ran into Tracy Capaldi Drewett, an old friend of mine, and I asked him what he'd been up to. The way you do, making conversation. Only the story he told me about a new programme he'd been working on for diplomats in Georgia was just so interesting and out of the ordinary that I knew at once we had to get him on the podcast to talk about it. Now usually this is the time where we'd get Kate Fitzgerald, our head of fact, to introduce this episode's guest, but Tracy does a pretty good job of that himself in the interview, so instead Kate is going to do a bit of scene setting. Kate, tell us about Georgia.
Hack facts.
Georgia is located in the Caucasus at the intersection of Eastern Europe and Western Asia. It is bounded by the Black Sea to the west, by Russia to the north and east, by Turkey to the southwest, by Armenia to the south, and by Azerbaijan to the southeast. The country has a population of 3.7 million people, excluding the Russian-occupied Georgian territories. In modern times, Georgia has had a turbulent history. After gaining independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, there followed a civil war, the Rose Revolution, and a new pro-Western stance leading to war with Russia, which still occupies parts of the country. The earliest evidence of wine to date has been found in Georgia, where 8,000-year-old wine jars were uncovered.
So, Jay Curtis, head of themes. What did we talk about?
Mostly, your discussion with Tracy took the form of a case study of the programme his company ICPS is delivering for the Georgia Foreign Service, from design to implementation and measurement. But the project has an interesting genesis against the background of the war in Ukraine, and what could be characterised as the EU's soft power interests in the region.
ICPS is an international organisation, but much of the SME input for this programme came from senior British civil servants and SPADs. One of the more interesting sidelights to emerge from this discussion for me was the surprising parallels that emerged between Georgia reaching out to the Western world for trade links and the UK also looking to forge new trade relationships in the shadow of Brexit. In that sense, it began to seem less about a more affluent and stable polity, i.e. the UK, teaching the Georgian diplomats how to do trade deals, something a bit more Socratic, more of a compare and contrast exercise perhaps. Whatever you make of this fascinating story, I think you'll agree that this was certainly not your average leadership programme. So welcome to The Learning Hack, Tracy. You've got an interesting story to tell us about your programme with Georgia's Foreign Service. But first of all, can you fill us in a bit on the organisation you work for and your role there?
Yeah, thank you, John. I'm the Executive Director at the International Centre for Parliamentary Studies. It's an interesting organisation. It's a global training organisation that serves individuals and organisations who are involved in public service. And these tend to be governments, agencies, NGOs, and also some in the charity sector. And focus on helping to improve policy making and public administration, and also parliamentary and electoral processes. We're not a huge organisation, but we are based in the UK, Europe, in Mauritius, and also in the USA.
So, an international organisation focused on what kinds of people do you train and what do you train them in?
We tend to train parliamentarians, high-level civil servants, and really the top tier in organisations who are looking to improve the life for citizens in the countries that they operate.
And is that done mostly face-to-face or digital? Or
historically, prior to the pandemic, it was primarily our face-to-face delivery, whether that be in country or whether that be learners travelling from the globe to attend our courses run in the UK or in the US or in Europe. However, that has now predominantly delivered virtually, with a mix of activities with some further digital support activities which we have brought in since the pandemic.
So big changes in your business model, or at least your kind of working methods.
Yeah, very much so, John, very much so. Somewhat imposed, in a sense it was a little bit of a sink or swim situation, because it was a huge change for us. But we were very early into migrating our business model to a virtual delivery approach. What we have found, which has been incredibly interesting, is that because we looked very carefully at the design of our programs based on the medium we were now having to deliver by, rather than just trying to put something online, is so because we designed to virtual delivery, we found that the evaluation of our courses by learners has been equal to, in some cases, better than the face-to-face delivery.
Oh, that's an interesting one. Yes. Because I think there is a perception always in the general public that online training is inherently not so good as face-to-face. But you're saying you're getting better marks now. Yeah,
absolutely. But I think it's been key in terms of thinking about how we designed the events themselves, recognising of reducing screen fatigue with lots of breaks, lots of different types of interaction exercises, making sure that you can really try and emulate the key things that work so well in the classroom in terms of sort of breakouts. And that's really down to the sort of the design rather than just simply the use of the technology.
So let's get into the particular programme we're talking about today, and we'll tease out the detail of what you do more kind of through that, I think. So this particular programme took place in Georgia. People will be aware of the country's recent history, perhaps secession from the Soviet Union in 1991. Perhaps less people will know about the Rose Revolution in 2003, followed by strongly pro-Western foreign policy, which led to worsening relationships with Russia, culminating in the Russo-Georgian War in 2008, and Russia still occupying parts of the country to this day. Now, I took the precaution of reading up on Wikipedia about the history of Georgia in the last few decades, and it is much more complicated than that. A country that's been subject to a lot of upheaval, and going back over the centuries as well. It doesn't necessarily have the kind of stability in its government that we do, which is interesting if you're kind of training people in government and in governing. So can you give us a bit of background on the country that's relevant to the learning needs that drove the project, perhaps? Situate the programme within the country of Georgia.
Yeah, I thought hard about this kind of area, John. In a sense, I hope I'm answering the right way in relation to this. But I think it's important to note, first of all, that the training element of this project was just one component of an interconnected cycle of promoting trade relations and supporting Georgia's economic development. And this was funded by the EU. And part of the rest of this programme was looking at enhancing the production of sort of knowledge-based marketing, boosting standards to strengthening the country's brand overall. And the second thing that I thought was important to bring out here was that though we were delivering a training component, and the event was titled Economic Diplomacy, Trade and Investment, it's really the economic diplomacy perspective which I think is perhaps the most key, particularly in relation to your question about the country itself. So the country is comparatively small. There's a population of close to 3.7 million individuals. And the government offices overseas, the embassies overseas, they have no designated economic offices abroad. Therefore, for Georgia, the economic diplomacy aspect is really, really important. So in other words, working with other governments and agencies from other countries to help with trade arrangements is key for the functions of their embassies as they stand. Therefore, it was seen that ICPS's experience both in trade and investment, but perhaps more importantly, in governmental diplomacy and its ability to deliver training to over 30 global occasions was essential.
Right.
The training gave the embassy staff kind of tools and ideas for better connecting local companies with international buyers. And on this point about the economic diplomacy being the kind of real key thing of the overall training program, I picked up one of the takeaways from one of the learners on the program who was in the embassy in the Czech Republic. And what they kind of flagged was they're saying is that the resources that were available to them in the embassies, working more closely with Czech Georgian chambers of commerce and increasing their networks of cooperating with partners outside of Prague to boost and reach other equally important regions in the Czech Republic, was facilitated by the training intervention that we produced for them. So again, talking about the aspect of it was being able to work with other countries to help promote the trade and investment opportunities for Georgia.
Okay, so let's focus on the learners a bit. Part of the reason I wanted to cover this on the podcast is because looking at cases like this really broadens our sense of what we're talking about when we're talking about learning. I think it's too often there are people talking in very abstract terms about learning and about training. And I think they tend to imagine a knowledge worker in an organisation, perhaps in London or a US city, doing something in a sector we all know a lot about. Actually, it's a much wider thing than this. And when we kind of focus on programs like this, we just see the diversity. So I'm interested in the kind of particularities of this situation and how they worked in this program. Long-winded question, I'm afraid. I'm famous for them. Tell us about the learners.
Yeah, okay. Well, as I flagged, ostensibly the learners were from embassies across the world. In fact, it was 80 individuals in 30 different countries working within embassies who are looking to promote trade and investment opportunities for Georgia. However, because it's a small country, they don't have a dedicated trade and investment teams within those embassies. So it's really a mixture of individuals within the embassies, all different kind of roles and responsibilities, all different levels of experience, and expertise and seniority. So we had some individuals on the training with the ambassadors themselves. So it was a very, very mixed group, all with different touch points in relation to conversations, networks and opportunities promoting Georgia, but not as a dedicated a trade and investment team, which ostensibly larger countries will have in their embassies.
So they wear a lot of hats. It's mixed ability teaching, so to speak. There are lots of different levels of seniority, and that would be very different to what you might find in, say, the British civil service, where people are quite specialised, aren't they?
Correct, John. Correct. Another little additional point which was quite key as part of the programme, because of this mixed group, of which we only were touching 80 with the programme, is that we also developed for them an ability for them to continue the training and cascade it to the other individuals within the embassies. And we did that by accrediting some of the ministry's trainers to continue delivering the programme to ensure there was sustainability of the learning throughout the next few years.
So let's get into more about the solution you designed for them. And obviously sustainability comes in kind of as an end part of that, I suppose. What was the mix of technology and human delivery? Give us the broad lines of the solution.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. And yes, you're absolutely right. It was a mix. So, as we say, we had 80 individuals across 30 countries who we were to touch with this training program initially. And we did that through the delivery of 5 virtual programs. So these were delivered in time zones to cater for the learners across the globe, delivered in a very compressed period of time. We then had 2 events which were for training the ministry's trainers, and all the learners were then requested to undertake an assignment, which was a mixture of drafting new strategies for trade and development and investment, along with a multi-choice regarding the best practice approaches that had been undertaken within the training. So quite a significant amount of work post the training event was then requested of the learners.
And these assignments, were they with these pieces of work which would actually be used in practice, or was it kind of theoretical?
Yeah, absolutely. It's really key, which I think might cover a little later on, talking about evaluation on how important these assignments were. But yeah, absolutely, John. Then beyond that is that we also, because of the seniority of some of the audience and the general strategy responsibility they would have for trade and investment from their embassy, is that we also provided virtual one-to-one coaching as well for certain individuals over and above the program. We also had the course accredited by a professional body, and that was with the Institute of Leadership and Management, because we wanted to ensure that over and above the quality of the program as a measure, we wanted to also assist with incentivizing the learners through a continued professional development aspect of the course, which they could include in their portfolio.
And that was part of the sustainability.
Correct, yeah, absolutely. Not included in the project, but also something which we are looking to offer to them, and we're in conversations with the ministry on that, is further access to the International Centre of Parliamentary Studies library of supportive e-learning materials, to help again with the sustainability.
Could you talk a bit about the SME input? Who were the experts that you brought to bear on this?
Yeah. So we had our training, design and delivery team were made up of 2 lead trainers, and both of those lead trainers had significant practitioner experience within trade and investment. In fact, the lead trainer was the ex-CEO of UK Trade and Investment, also Human Resources Director at what was the Department of Trade and Industry. And over and above the 2 trainers, we also brought in guest speakers who had worked extensively with embassies around the world, also personally targeted with developing trade and investment opportunities for over 40 years. So ostensibly the learning experience was a mix of real strong theoretical and practical experience in the topic, but also some hands-on kind of war stories in relation to how that would affect them individually when they are trying to achieve the trade and investment targets set by the ministry.
And presumably some of that would be delivered in a kind of confidential, non-attributable basis, so that people could actually get the real story, not just the press release, as it were.
Absolutely, yeah. So there's very much Chatham House rules in relation to certain aspects of the delivery of the programme when we had the guest speakers.
Yeah, I should imagine there are, very large areas of confidentiality in this. There's a popular supposition that all diplomats are actually spies. Not what I necessarily hold, but I've heard this said. Yeah.
I couldn't possibly comment, John, but no. In all seriousness, absolutely. It is a very sensitive kind of area, and therefore. Really important that we gave the learners the opportunity to really talk openly.
Can you talk a bit about the technology in particular? Was this all virtual classroom? Did you use an LMS?
No. So this was delivered on virtual classrooms. It was a mixture of Zoom and also Teams, just dependent on access for those particular groups. But we also delivered the post-course activity, so that's the assignments from the ICPS platform. Right. So that was delivered similarly to an LMS.
In the struggle against the forgetting curve that learning people are engaged in every day, there are no magic formulas, but there is science. For well over a century, psychologists have known that the spacing effect unlocks deep learning and helps learners power through to peak performance. And yet who uses it, despite the fact that modern learning systems like LXPs make it almost easy? I've written a white paper with Learning Pool that shows how you can use the spacing effect to beat the forgetting curve. Download it now. The Learning Hack podcast is supported by Learning News, the learning sector's newswire. Rob and his team are good friends of the podcast, and we really value the help and advice we've had from them, and they do a great job. For the very latest news from around the learning sector, for interviews with learning leaders, the latest from learning sector vendors and features on workplace learning, go to learningnews.com. You'll notice from the sequence of these questions, I've written many case studies because the questions kind of fall into that form. And the next thing that's always, it's similarly with award submissions, I have to say. So the next question is, what challenges did the programme throw up that are specific to this highly individual set of circumstances? And how did you overcome them?
Yeah. Okay. Similarly, as being involved in so many training programs over the years, I could go through all the challenges that a training provider who would be delivering such a program would have. However, there was one unique challenge for this program. The program delivery started in February of this year. Considering the geographical location and the uncertainty facing all staff in relation to what started in February of this year, it couldn't have been a worse time to start the program.
Yeah, you're talking about the Ukraine.
Exactly. So suddenly, an incredibly busy group of individuals were even more busy and also more difficult to contact. So we had a real concern that we would be not reaching the audience because they just would not be available. However, we went ahead with the program, and to overcome this challenge really was an exercise in rescheduling and rescheduling learners again from event to event. Just to make sure that they could undertake the program in the most flexible way possible. So there was a huge amount of administration making sure that learners who were originally scheduled on an event, who then couldn't turn up for that event or could only turn up for one day or half a day, we rescheduled and rescheduled. But the key was the flexibility of the trainers to be able to bring coherence to the experience of each of the learners based on how they were scheduled onto these events.
Let's talk about the measurement of the programme. Let's get into your Kirkpatricks. How was and is the success of the project to be measured?
Measurement was key both in terms of the EU, who funded the project, as well as the rest of the project stakeholders. And we employed two approaches in relation to evaluation. The first is now complete, which is a post-course survey. And that was kind of level one, fairly standard, and that was completed. And within that, actually, is that we've been surprised at how positive and above the kind of average that we were expecting in relation to the scoring on the programme. But then there is also a second level post-course survey, which is going to be conducted in 6 months' time. And this is designed particularly to try and establish the application of what was learned in the workplace. Okay. However, going back to your point earlier on, John, when you were talking about the assignments and the application of the assignments, that's really, really the key part of that second part of the survey. Because what we are looking to do there is to make a connection between the assignment work that's been created and what the learners were asked to do was to create a new strategic plan on how they would be promoting a trade and investment for Georgia based on the trade targets set for the embassies. So there'll be a direct correlation between the performance of those embassies in relation to their trade and investment attraction versus the new strategic plans that each individual has created as part of the assignment for the programme. So that will be a real kind of litmus test in relation to the practical success of this programme.
So there is an element of measurement of transfer into performance, as it were.
Correct.
Quite a strong element by the sound of it. Yeah.
Yeah, very, very strong.
What does this programme have to tell us about learning in this type of context? I mean, obviously it touches a number of bases. It's got an element of leadership there within a political context. There's the element of face-to-face versus digital transformation happening very quickly within your company. But also something we haven't really touched on is the kind of specific qualities that the particular organisation you're in bring to this. You know, I'm not necessarily asking you to do a marketing spiel about this, but the kind of positioning of, Georgia's had an incredibly tumultuous history, not just in the last few decades, but going back centuries. Britain's had a great deal of stability. We had a revolution in the 17th century, and by and large, the Glorious Revolution perhaps, things have stayed pretty stable here. Does that give us a particular ability to pass on kind of processes and norms to people doing a similar job around the world who may not have had that kind of continuity and chance to kind of build a culture and so on? I'm slightly putting words into your mouth here, but
I think that's a really interesting point, and to a degree I would concur with that. However, I think that the real success of the programme, or at least the success of the engagement with the audience, was based on the practical experience of the trainers and the guest speakers. Okay. And the guest speakers weren't ostensibly necessarily UK based. Okay. So it was really about talking about what is best practice from a global perspective, and also is how was that practically applied on the ground, irrespective of what nationality you are. So I think so it was a mixture of both, really. I think, John, it was yes, there were certain things which quite clearly the audience felt that a UK perspective was a good one, but also the practicality of how things were done for other people in the position of those embassy staff, again, irrespective of their nationality.
But could also point out that, without getting too heavily into contentious territory, as a company that is having to kind of go out to the world to make trade negotiations following a kind of political change, we're slightly in a similar position, post-Brexit, that you have kind of the British equivalents of these people will be going out trying to negotiate trade agreements around the world now that we're no longer part of the EU. Was there a bit of compare and contrast going on there, do you think?
Absolutely. Very, very much so. And again, a very interesting point is last week is that I had the pleasure of being at the awards ceremony in relation to this training event, and within the audience of that ceremony were individuals from the British Embassy who ostensibly had just been there in relation to setting trade relationships with Georgia. So I think there was an absolute similarity in relation to the situation facing them.
Yeah, probably that plays stronger than the type of historical parallels I was trying to bring into it. So, can you tell us more about the future of the programme now? What is going to happen now with this programme?
As you may recall, John, I talked about the fact that we'd built a capacity for continuing the training with a Train the Trainer programme. So as far as the funding into this project by the EU, not just for the training, but for all of the investment activities to be supporting Georgia for trade and investment, that has a finite period. And therefore it was really, really important that in all aspects of the programme, including the training, that there was a ability for Georgia to continue developing its people in relation to and its position in relation to trade and investment. So to answer your question, looking forward from the training perspective, is that we will continue to support the individuals who have now been trained to deliver the programme on an ongoing basis outside of the project. But the view is that they will then roll out a continuing programme of development for not just the 80 individuals, but all the embassy staff in promoting trade based on the capacity they now have for training the trainer. We also, as you had also responded, is given the facility for learners to become members of a professional body, and the accredited training that they undertake gives them membership of the Institute of Leadership and Management to continue their professional development. And we have continued that license capability going forward. So beyond our time working with Georgia, is that the Georgians will be able to also provide membership to this professional body to learners going forward. And then finally, I think that the assignments and the creation of the strategies for each embassy to be trying to meet the targets requested for trade and development by the ministry will be an ongoing process. But now they have a greater capability to reflect on those strategies and adapt according to the situation that they find. So I think it's really quite positive from a longer term perspective, and I think that's been one of the big takeaways from the stakeholders on the project.
Tracy, you and I have some history. We've worked in a couple of companies together. You've been my boss and my client. But can you fill in some of your own personal background for me and for the listeners? And I'm going to ask you, what drew you to learning in the first place? How did you get involved with it? How did you get into the profession? And what's been your career progression to date?
Yeah, okay. Yes, John, we've known each other quite some time. Actually, starting with my band supporting your band years ago back in Brighton. Oh my God! Yeah, but like many, I've reflected on many things during the pandemic. So your question is one I had been thinking about, just generally, to be honest. I think by chance I found myself working for a management consultancy way back in 1989. And they had an aspiration to scale their expertise. And so it was just purely by chance that I found myself in that organisation. And it wasn't training per se that had interested me and kept me there for quite some time. But more importantly, it was having an impact. But once I was in the training environment, I was hooked. So then I've worked in content development organisations, I've worked in learning management system companies, and I've worked in managed service organisations where the scale of solutions was quite mind-blowing. And that was providing huge projects to governments. So that's really kind of made quite an impact on me. And I suppose really now that I'm where I am now, the International Centre of Parliamentary Studies, it goes back to that premise of really making an impact. Because what we do at ICPS now is helping governments create better policy, therefore improving the lives of citizens. And I can't think of a better place to be honest, in base of that. So it really goes back to where I kind of started, making an impact, and that is so much connected with being able to help people's development.
It's a very diplomatic answer in that you're naming no names there, but we will put your link to your LinkedIn profile and people can look at the names of the companies there. I think it's very interesting. You've covered the whole, such a wide, from kind of micro learning to publisher platforms at Semantico and, as you say, managed services at Capita, Knowledge Pool and so on. I think that you've just had such an interesting career, and I'm so glad that we bumped into each other so many times during that career. And I'd especially like to thank you for taking the time today. Thanks a lot, Tracy.
My pleasure, John. My pleasure.
That's all on the Learning Hack podcast for this time. Many thanks to Tracy and to our sponsors, Learning Pool. The Learning Hack is completely independent and transparently funded by sponsorship. If you want to help others find us, please like, follow, rate, review and subscribe on your podcast platform of choice or on YouTube.
Next time, we're going to be talking about jobs, more specifically, your job as a learning professional. In the age of the Great Resignation, what is happening in the labour market to affect you and your career? Nick Jones has the answers.
Stay curious, learning people.